Joyce, thanks so much for talking with me today. And before we start talking about Fourth Church, can you tell us what you're doing now?
I'm currently pastor and head of staff at Swarthmore Presbyterian Church in Swarthmore, Pennsylvania.
And what years were you at Fourth, and what was your role?
I served as associate pastor for congregational life at Fourth from the years of from 2005 until 2015 during Allie Trowbridge's maternity leave. And I was there part-time as one to fill in some of the congregational life responsibilities that she had. And then when it became clear that Allie was going to return from maternity leave, but shift her responsibilities to become the associate pastor for congregational care, that's when a search committee was formed, and Dana Ferguson asked me if I might consider being a candidate for associate pastor for congregational life. And I served in that role until 2015.
What drew you to Fourth Church?
I had learned about Fourth Presbyterian Church when I was a young girl. My parents had gone to Montreat Conference Center, and they had heard John Buchanan preach there. And my mom came back and talked about this preacher, and they had also heard about Fourth Church when my older sister went to Northwestern University in Evanston. And when we would visit her, we as a family ended up worshiping at Fourth Church. And so I was in high school when I thought about going into ministry, and had already known about Fourth Church. And then when I got into divinity school as a Master's of Divinity student, I knew that I wanted to do an internship at Fourth Presbyterian Church. And so that was one of the factors that even led me to decide to go to University of Chicago Divinity School instead of somewhere on the East Coast. Congregational life at a church the size of Fourth Church had the purpose of trying to make a big church feel like a small church. And in fact, that was what John Buchanan told me when I first met with him, and he, asked me if I might be interested in this work. And so immediately the Congregational Life Session Committee worked with me to develop all kinds of groups so that our congregation, which was so large, could find some kind of affinity group that they could regularly meet with. So we had groups called 30s, 40s for people who were in their 30s, 40s. We had a Cornerstones group for couples in their 50s and older. We had Fourth Dimensions for individuals who are 50 and older. We had women at Fourth for any woman in our congregation. We had a men's group that John Boyle led monthly, and we had a young adults group. And then we also began to form new moms groups. And this was a hit. We began with one new moms group, and it multiplied at some point into like 7 new moms groups. And those moms, of course, as their kids grew up, they just stopped calling themselves new moms groups and were just moms groups. And so there was a constant evolution. But one of the longest living groups, longest standing groups in our church's history was the Benevolent Guild. And I don't know if they're continuing to meet, but they were a very special group that I enjoyed meeting with regularly, weekly. And then there was also the sewing and knitting group. So there was a biking group, and they would have bike to church Sundays that Mike Ban led. And then one of the most meaningful groups for me, from which I learned the most, was the Muslim Christian Fellowship Exchange. And I guess it was after 9/11 that our congregation learned that we really didn't have a relationship with any local mosque. And so my predecessor, Allie Trowbridge, and one of the members of the 30s, 40s group and one of the members of Fourth Dimension came to her and said, we need to become friends with Muslims in the city of Chicago. And then right then, Allie went on maternity leave. And so that task of building a relationship fell to me. And I explored, where we might begin. And the Downtown Islamic Center became our first congregation to congregation relationship with a Muslim community. And after we got to know them, we realized that Downtown Islamic Center was at that time a place where Muslims who were working in the city could pray according to their practices, but that most of those Muslims lived in the suburbs. And so eventually we had to build relationships with many different suburban mosques. And then we realized that the church as a whole, many different groups were interested in learning about Islam, including different programs like in adult education. And to that end, we formed an interfaith resource committee so that we could be a resource to the whole church. So that was one of the greatest joys for me. In 2011, I was approached by the personnel committee and Callum McLeod to serve as the chief transitions officer. And that job consisted of two big projects. And one was to help the church plan and prepare for the opening and usage of the Gratz Center. And the second component of that role was to undergo a resource allocation and mission prioritization. We needed to study and really know how are all of our resources of money and time and space and even volunteer time being allocated throughout the church and through Chicago Lights. And we needed to hold that up and say, is this is our mirror image? Is this what we really think our priorities should be? Should this be the story that we uphold? That process led to a realignment of how we were going to spend and allocate our resources, churchwide and in Chicago Lights. Both of those processes, the planning of the usage and opening of the Gratz Center and the resource allocation and mission prioritization, were important to the transition that we were undergoing at the time. We were both in a search for a new pastor, and we were about to open this humongous new building, the Gratz Center. And Callum said to me, Joyce, the building's going up, and when it opens, we can't just all rush in there and claim our space. So we had to develop policies about how the kitchen would be used. We had to develop policies about where and when it would be appropriate to serve alcohol for social occasions. We had to develop and carry out a big hospitality campaign for the whole church and for the staff. And we had to have a cornerstone laying and a dedication of the building, as well as a big community grand opening. And we realized that we couldn't do justice to all of our ministries and our partnerships in the city of Chicago through just of grand opening. So we had a whole month to showcase those ministries to the community. And it was just a terrific opportunity to to appreciate the ministries of our church and of Chicago Lights, and to share them with the community. One of the things I learned was that we need to really think big, and we also need to recognize that the details matter a lot. And so it was very exhilarating to be able to do that for the church. During my time at Fourth, I would say the most influential person for me, professionally, vocationally, was John Buchanan. And I say that knowing that I actually didn't spend very much time with John. And yet his leadership was palpable throughout the church. I learned from him to think big, and that is something that he more than once, said to me. And I learned from him how to delegate responsibilities and how putting processes in place that you don't have to continually refine and touch can help you run a large institution. I learned also from Dana Ferguson, who had been the executive associate pastor for the first few years of my being on staff. And I remember Dana telling me, when you make decisions about church, you got to make decisions that will help the church to grow. So there are many times when churches have to solve problems, and in the immediate term, it might seem that you're solving a problem, but really, if you're not careful, you're putting in a decision that's not going to help the church to grow in the long run. And so Dana understood that, and I could tell that she was always considering that. From Callum McLeod, who was the head of staff at the end of my time there, before he moved to Scotland, I learned the importance of a ministry of presence. Callum knew when to just show up and be there. And when he was with you, he was truly present. And sometimes in ministry, we just don't have time to prepare everything ahead of time, but we have to show up. And then if you're just really present in that moment, it goes a long way. And I learned that from Callum. I would say most of my learning, however, came from the extraordinary leaders that make up the congregation. And I always thought that I was so lucky to be serving in the area of congregational life, because all of those groups and committees that I was serving were led by these leaders who were not clergy. And they brought their best practices from various different sectors and industries into their work at church. And I knew that if I observed well, I could pick up some good life lessons.
What was your favorite thing about your time at Fourth?
My favorite aspect of being at Fourth was that I learned that in a big city, institutions are made of people. Sometimes we forget that. Sometimes we think that cities are anonymous and these big buildings and institutions are anonymous, but we have to remember that they're made up of people, and that can be a very empowering realization. I remember walking down Michigan Avenue with Sophia, my daughter, who was just a little girl at the time, and telling her, inside all these buildings are people who make things happen. And she got to see that firsthand on Friday nights and Monday nights at Friday night supper and Monday night supper, where Fourth Church, through all of its volunteers and with Larry Nicholson's leadership, could serve a significant homeless population in our city. And so I think for me, one of my favorite aspects of being at Fourth was to be to be part of a significant institution in the life of that city. One of the greatest privileges of being at Fourth was to be one among so many ministers. And for me, that was a tremendous learning ground. When I first started there, I remember John Boyle, Tom Rook, Donna Gray, Allie Trowbridge, Callan McLeod, Dana Ferguson, John Buchanan. They were all the more seasoned pastors. And then there was John Best, Adam Franchek, and me. And we had all started serving at Fourth in pretty quick succession after one another. And it was just really helpful to have that many ministers on staff, because for the socialization, you get socialized into the norms of an institution when there are that many people on staff, and you can sort of see, when do they speak, when do they refrain from speaking, it's those kinds of things, those kinds of cues that I think helped me to grow up faster in this profession than I might otherwise have done.